Teresa.
It's not fair.
Now is the fragile ceasefire in Ukraine, which is holding so far after a truce was negotiated overnight. But while the fighting has stopped there, in northern Iraq, the operation to stop Islamic State fighters could be about to be stepped up, with talk Australia could join airstrikes.
For more on this and the other top stories of the week, we're joined now by Director of Campaigns and Communications, Bruce Hawker, and Deputy Director of the Sydney Institute, Anne Henderson. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Bruce, I'll start with you. 1 year of the Abbott government tomorrow. Obviously, you were heavily involved with the last days of the Rudd government. What do you make of it 1 year on?
Well, I think it's a much more ideological government than we expected. There was certainly no talk in the election campaign about cuts to health, education, pensions, the ABC.
They did say they were going to balance the books, though.
Yeah, they didn't go into any detail about any of those things, and I think that's taken the Australian public somewhat by surprise. And I think it's revealed Tony Abbott to be much more ideological than most people would have expected. I mean, everyone always knew that he was a very conservative man, particularly on social issues, but the consensus was he was more like the DLP than the Liberal Party. And I think that's been disabused very much now by him, by Joe Hockey, and by the budget measures that they're trying to introduce.
And I guess we can look at the polls for one aspect, which have been negative as far as his performance is concerned. But let's turn to just how effective Tony Abbott and his government have been.
Well, we've all forgotten that the first year of the Hawke government was pretty lousy and nearly lost the 84 election. The first year of Howard and a few from then on was pretty messy. And the interesting thing that I think Troy Bramston drew upon the other day in an article was that the messy years, the governments that were messy in the early part, ended up being long-living. And the ones that looked like they were triumphant, and the Rudd, the Whitlam type governments, failed very quickly. And government is about practical measures. It's about having to do the things that people need to be done, even if they don't like them. And I wouldn't say he's ideological. I'd say this is very pragmatic. This is a very pragmatic government. This is the sort of government that's listening to Treasury. Treasury saying you have to get on top of an unsustainable spending spree that's been going on. We can't live on the credit card forever, and unless we do this, it'll be much worse later. Now, polls are going to go all over the place. And I think the funny thing about this length of time the budget's taken, they didn't go in with the sort of Beasley black hole kind of rhetoric before the election or after. But what's happening quietly is that as people natter and listen, and the nastiness keeps, the nasty sort of choices that have to be made are made, people are starting to get the message that there is a problem. Now, this may take time. And it's a different way of doing it. I don't know whether it's a wise way of doing it, but it's going to have to be done. When Labor gets back into office, one day it will, they're going to have to do it too.
And I'd like to ask you, where do you see the specific, we're going to go very micro here, what's the strongest point and the weakest point in the government at this 1 year mark?
I think the strongest point is his strength. Tony Abbott is showing...
So the leader's office is the strong
I am
point.
the leader, and in spite of the fact that times are tough, we have to take tough decisions, we are going to do it. And that's then spilled over into foreign policy.
Well, I was going to say, is that perhaps demonstrated more in his foreign policy?
Well, I think it started with the economics, but it's more likely to be in his favour with foreign policy, because it's much easier for people to see the problem, heads being chopped off and horrible things happening to women and children and families and religious groups and whatever across this Middle East. Ukraine is also another area where I think people will be very worried. So it's played into his hands in a sense. He's looking strong on the budget. Whether he's doing well or not, that doesn't matter. But the fact is that in foreign policy, people are with him.
Okay, Bruce, highs and lows from your point of view?
Well, I think they have done quite well in the international area, and I think that's come as a surprise, but that's been something that's been delivered to them, and Abbott's taken advantage of that because, the budget is going down so poorly, and I think Joe Hockey has been shown to be a pretty poor treasurer in terms of selling the budget. And I think one of the strengths of previous governments, whether it was Hawke with Keating or whether it was Howard with Costello, is you had strong treasurers who were able to go out and sell the story. He hasn't been able to do that at all, and that's been the weakness of the government, and that will, I think, continue to be a significant problem for the government. And I think they have legitimacy problems because all these things were announced in the budget and not in the election campaign, and the Australian electorate doesn't really like to be taken by surprise.
Well, and Bruce says obviously the Treasurer has been a poor performer. I guess if you look at the positives, Julie Bishop has been a standout performer for the government, no matter which side you support. There's been consensus essentially that she has done a good job as Foreign Minister in recent events. Let's move to the issue of Australia's response to Iraq. Now, we heard from the Foreign Minister this morning, perhaps Australia, the government, willing to step up even further its commitment to Iraq.
Well, look, it's going to happen, and I've just done a book on Menzies' first government, 39 to 41, and what's interesting when you go back to 1939, how absolutely unwilling a lot of Australians were, almost a majority of Australians were, to do anything about Hitler or to be part of any campaign, especially the Labor Party. They were the strongest at not wanting us to send any troops to fight Hitler. And you look at Ukraine now, and I'm thinking of George Will's article, and I think it was in the Washington Times last week. The patterns are there. Let's hope it doesn't end up the way it ended up in 39. But the longer these nasty forces are allowed to encroach across the lives of communities and nations and whatever, the more the rest of the world is sort of left thinking it must be part of the action against it. And someone the other day said what they should do is divide Ukraine, put 10,000 NATO troops into the border, aim the nuclear bombs at Russia and say enough. Now, no one's going to do that, but some people say that's what they should have done to Germany in the 1920s. It's not quite in the same league, but the thing is, when do you stand up and when do you show weakness? And we talk about appeasement. Well, are we going to just be appeasers now, or are we going to actually take a stand? And I think most people want to do something.
Do you see an appetite domestically for taking a stand?
Well, I think there are two issues here. One's Iraq and one's Ukraine. We don't want to conflate the two.
No.
I think there is a pretty strong appetite right now for more action in Iraq, and it's been fed, of course, by these horrific scenes of the murders of these American journalists and the speed and aggression of ISIS through Iraq. And I think if you asked the person in the street now, they would say there should be some response supported by Australia, including airstrikes. I don't think there'll be much argument with that. Of course, it becomes much more complex when you're asked to go to the next stage and perhaps put boots on the ground, something which the Americans aren't talking about right now, but which is potentially down the road if ISIS can't be stopped. I mean, they're a 10,000 person force, and they've got the Iraqi government on the run.
Yeah.
Do you, though, have reservations about Ukraine and Australia's involvement there?
Well, I do, personally. I mean, that's a role for NATO, surely. And I thought when the Prime Minister started talking about sending military advisors to the Ukraine, I wondered whether really we're going a bit too far there. We have had a role in the Middle East for many years. Some of it's been advisable, some of it's been ill-advised. But in the case of the Ukraine and Russia, going back into history, I think the last time Australians were involved in anything to do with Russia was after the First World War, when they were fighting the White forces against the Reds in 1919.
No, we were against the Nazi-Soviet pact. Australia, with the Allies, was opposed to Russia's support for Hitler up until June 1941.
Yeah, look, I'm talking about actual boots on the ground. What I'm talking about is boots on the ground. What the Prime Minister's talking now about is a military presence in the Ukraine using advisors. And I think that's probably going too far. That's why we have NATO. NATO's there to respond appropriately to a Russian aggression against NATO members and their allies. And that's where we are right now with Russia. Whatever Putin decides to do will be determined by Putin and to some extent by the response of NATO and the United States. Australia doesn't really, I think, have a big role to play there.
I'd like to ask you both, do you think Australians feel somewhat more involved in this crisis in Iraq because of these grisly videos coming out? How do you think that
we've
social
got people
media
over there
affects it?
involved. We've got Australian Muslims high up in this ISIS madness. We have people back here in Western Sydney and maybe in Melbourne who are actually taking propaganda of this stuff and training up and hoping to go over and join them. I mean, we are involved, and we are involved in Ukraine. I mean, our people were shot down out of the sky by Ukrainian dissidents. I mean, it's such a global interface now, you can't just say that's over there, we're over here. We are involved. And I think having an interest in Ukraine or having a part to play there, it also links back to the G20, where we're hosting the G20 this year.
Well, that's a more interesting issue, what they do with regard to Putin when the G20 rolls around. But as to Ukraine, that's a role for NATO. NATO will perform its role effectively as it has in the past.
All right, just before we leave you, we would like to get your opinion on this latest issue of cloud security. Now, I'm sure everyone is aware of the intimate photos, the nude photos that have been leaked from some celebrities during the week. What it's actually thrown up, though, is the security issue of cloud computing, be it photos that you store there or perhaps more alarmingly, financial details and the like.
Absolutely. I was warned about this by some tech head a year ago, that iCloud...
Well, you don't have a choice, do you, once you get a password or an account?
Everything in cyberspace regarded as not necessarily secure. I mean, even banks know this. They spend so much money just making sure that their systems are secure. And hacking's the sort of trade of the century, isn't it? I mean, I haven't got any nude photos to put in cloud, but I tell you what, I wouldn't be doing it if I did.
You can declare it here. Bruce, like, what about all this stuff about metadata and these, surveillance laws we discussed? Doesn't that draw into question how are we going to, make it all secure?
It sure does, and I think we do need to be very careful about diving straight into the whole metadata or releasing all metadata. I mean, most people would be very nervous about releasing their personal details of all their files, their emails and so forth. And sometimes you can comfortably say, oh, well, if they've got nothing to hide, why wouldn't they like to see it all out there? But, the truth is there's a lot of personal information that's contained in these sorts of communications that people have, and people do have a right to privacy. As to iCloud, though, stay right away from it if you don't want to see some of those things up there for all to see.
Bruce Hawker, Anne Henderson, thanks so much.
Thank you both.
Thank you.